Hello and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 3, Advanced Certificate in Procurement and Supply Operations. This is Module 3, Contract Administration, and we're looking at Learning Outcome 3, which is to know the effective tendering. We're going to cover things like identifying the initial actions and processes associated with tendering, the process documentation and associated content, evaluation and acceptance processes, and the regulations that can impact on procurement. So let's recap on what we've seen before, just to remind you of the 5 rights of procurement. Our job is to get the right quantity, in the right quality, at the right time, to and from the right place, at the right price. Where quantity is concerned, too little could result in production line stopping and too much increases the storage costs. Quality, inferior quality could halt production. Superior quality increases the cost. Time, products and services need to be delivered when the organisation needs them and is expecting them as well. Too early or too late are as much of a problem as each other. In terms of place, they need to be obtained from the right suppliers and delivered to the right place. And price has to be competitive, but it shouldn't be prioritised over the other factors. And ultimately, if you have an error in any of these rights, it could increase the costs to your organisation. The 6th right is often known as the right supplier. So make sure you work with a supplier that's got a good reputation rather than a bad reputation. Understanding the supply market is critical to designing a good tender, and the tool you can use here is the Porter's 5 Forces model, which is used to analyse the power of the factors in the market. Either the supplier has the power or the buyers have the power. If you look at the power of the suppliers and the threat of substitutes to the right and to the bottom, this is where the suppliers have maximum or very high power, monopolies or oligopolies. So actually what the approach might be for those is to negotiate. Whereas on the left and at the top, the power of buyers and the threat of new entrants, there is a lot of competition there, either for the same or similar products. So this is probably a better area where you would issue a tender or a quote. Steepled, this is an external environmental tool that you can look at to identify the factors that could influence the market and consider whether each factor will affect its suppliers equally. So from a social point of view, income and labour, education, living conditions, health factors and attitudes towards work and leisure. From a technological point of view, you need to look at the available technology as well as anything that's emerging and coming onto the market. And also the attitudes that customers take towards technology. Economy, you're looking at both national, regional and international economies, but also things like taxation, inflation, deflation, exchange rates, they all fit in that category. From an environmental point of view, it's the things like attitudes towards waste management, recycling, sustainability, but also the natural resources and the ecological change and balance for things like plant and wildlife. Politically, we look at whether they're stable or unstable, the party political dynamics, international agreements and policies. Legal will look at things like compliance with regulations, but also any new laws that are going to come up that potentially might impact your market. Ethical, this is looking at the things like modern slavery and the necessary reporting procedures and the impact that it would have on the reputation of your business. And demographics looks at people and population. It goes into things like the ethnic diversity, age group dynamics, gender differences and population shifts. The SWOT analysis is looking at influences that could help you to target your market and especially looking at your key suppliers. The strengths and weaknesses are internal, the opportunities and threats are external. So you need to think about internally what's going well, what's not going well, what are we good at, what are we not good at? And then externally, what opportunities are there out there to do something different as the demographics changed, as the supply markets changed? But also what are the threats that are probably going to come from your competitors or a supplier that sees you as a nuisance. The idea behind this is to understand your weaknesses and threats and opportunities and, do something about it. The thing about external market research is it's happening whether you like it or not. It's your choice whether or not you do something about that in a positive way that's going to help your business. If you ignore them, the likelihood is that you will be in a situation where you won't be able to compete. Now, engaging with suppliers can happen in a number of forms at various stages, but it carries risks and benefits. So early supplier engagement is about pre-market engagement, talking to suppliers before and during the designing of the tender process and contract documents. Pre-contract dialogue is an opportunity to have a more focused conversation with suppliers and looking at the prospective tender and contract. So it'll include things like sharing proposed contract terms and price matrices to see if it's something they can work with. Or you could be seeking direct input into your specification, just to check that you're not asking for something that's going to be difficult for manufacturers to produce. The good thing is that you can discover any pitfalls and problems that suppliers have come across with other buyers, which helps you to gain a clearer understanding of how interested potential suppliers are. Informal dialogue occurs before an approach to the market, but competitive dialogue is in effect the actual approach to the market. And the purpose of that is to gain more information about the market, to understand your options, identify potential suppliers, and potentially help to refine the specification. But there are some risks, despite its usefulness. So these risks need to be managed when engaging at an early stage with suppliers. So let's start with individual suppliers. They may exert too much influence over the specification or selection criteria. So this is an example where a really innovative supplier may come in with a really glossy, shiny solution that you are blown away with. And you look at it and say, that's exactly what I want, that's amazing. But they may be the only supplier that can do that because nobody else has caught up with them. If that happens, then they'll be the only ones that can bid. You'll limit your competition. That clearly can delay the start of the procurement as well while you're having those conversations. But if you do have more than one supplier, there's a risk that they'll collude and form something known as a cartel, which is illegal. Suppliers that aren't involved at the early stage might feel disadvantaged, and others may be reluctant to engage in a group setting because they're worried about sharing confidential information with competitors. And you end up possibly with unintentional sharing of confidential or protected information. But the information the suppliers share with you during this time is confidential. But usually the stuff the purchaser supplies isn't. So what can you do to overcome and avoid these risks? Try and contact a range of suppliers using a range of methods. This will ensure opportunities to engage are widely advertised. Plan ahead and start early, allowing enough time for responses. Do remember, people are doing this free of charge. There's no guarantee that you're ever going to go as far as a tender. So they're doing this for nothing. So you can't be demanding and ask them to turn it around in 24 hours. You need to give them enough time. But ensure as well the information shared as part of this engagement is documented and shared with everybody. Be clear, though, about how confidential information and intellectual property will be handled. You might need to consider signing a non-disclosure. In terms of how to engage, there are a number of ways you can do it. Group briefings and Q&A sessions. I mean, these work really well if you do breakfast briefings, but make the location easy to get to. Advertise it widely so that other people know exactly how and where that's going to take place. You can just invite particular decision makers from your suppliers on a one-to-one basis, which might be easier to manage if you've got confidential matters. You can issue questionnaires or do sort of surveys over the phone to find out, information from them using a questionnaire, but maybe keep it simple, keep it concise. Don't ask too much information that way. You can attend trade show events and industry events as well. So going up and meeting suppliers on a trade show stand, looking at their products, seeing demos, or even talking to other buyers as well that are there. That's a really good place to find information out from sort of competitors, I guess, because you could just be standing waiting for a coffee or what have you, and ask them where they work and what they currently do for a particular procurement. If they're doing something exciting and innovative, they're more willing to share that information because it's hard not to brag. So that's basically the sort of early stages. The next stage is to consider your process for approaching the market formally. And one of those options is to run a tender. And tenders are, used in more complicated, high value, formal processes, usually run by the government, to be fair. That's not to say that private sector don't do it, but it's very common in the public sector. Now, the most common two are open and restricted. I'll talk about the single stage as well at the end, but the open tender works a little bit like an advertised job. It's advertised externally, so anybody that sees the advert can submit a tender to offer to serve you as a product or a service. The restricted one, though, it will get advertised, but interested suppliers will have to go through two stages. The first stage is a pre-qualification questionnaire, and it's more about the suitability of the bidder rather than them submitting a bid. And then only those that are suitable will get invited to tender. So it's a way of kind of reducing the number of people that get to submit a tender. The single stage selective one is when you select suppliers yourself. So they're probably going to be incumbents or from a framework or something like that. So it's not advertised, that one. And this diagram just shows you a restricted process, which is the longest one out of the three. So there's quite a few steps in that, as you can see, from advertisement all the way through to accepting the tender. And in the public sector, that could take us about 6 months to get from one end to the other. So it's a very long, drawn-out process. The key documents that you would use in a tender, firstly, let's start with the pre-qualification questionnaire that I mentioned in the restricted process. This is not early supplier engagement, it's part of your formal tender. And you either do it to do a two-stage restricted process, you use this to sort of knock suppliers out, or it goes as part of your open tender. And what it does is it requests information about the general business standing of your supplier, including things like financials, relevant experience, their insurances, health and safety, data protection, environmental controls and human rights. And much of this can be covered by Carter's 10Cs, which was things like capacity, commitment, cost, control, culture. If you can look those up, it's the Carter's 10Cs. Then you've got the invitation to tender document itself, which is a request from the buyer to the supplier asking for a full offer to perform the contract, which includes full details of how the contract requirements will need to be met and how the supplier will be assessed. It'll include things like a general invitation, which is like a rules of engagement. This is what you need to do and when and how. It will be appended with a specification, conformance or performance, draft terms and conditions. The supplier is going to need to know what terms you're expecting them to adhere to as part of that tender. And other draft schedules like KPIs, key performance indicators, and the pricing schedule. The contract terms should be fully developed by the purchaser, but there'll be a number of gaps that still need to be filled in. So it's things like the price, the delivery date, and supporting schedules that the supplier will submit in their return. And any areas for negotiation should be indicated, but suppliers should be able to seek or clarify anything that doesn't seem right during the tender phase. The KPIs need to be sufficient so suppliers can understand this level of service that you want them to provide, as well as the consequences of failing to do so. It therefore needs to include a set of KPIs, what the indicators are and how they'll be measured, the targets that need to be achieved, and the service credit or bonus scheme that might apply if they exceed or fail to exceed the targets. Tender documents must clearly set out how prices are going to be submitted in order to enable the purchaser to easily compare the offers. Discount rates can be used to price contracts, but where there's a published or national or sector-wide schedule, this could be used as a starting point. Once the deadline for submitting tenders has passed, all tenders should be opened at the same time. And if an error is discovered in the tender, the supplier should be given an opportunity to either allow their tender to stand or withdraw. So it's a standby or withdraw approach. If they allow their tender to stand, they're not allowed to correct the error. They just have to accept the error they've made, or they withdraw it. Qualified bids also should be rejected, and qualified bids sound positive, but they're not. It's actually the opposite. A qualified bid is where a supplier has essentially submitted a tender, but they've exempted themselves from the terms and conditions, or they've changed the specification in some way. So it's not fair because the other suppliers have bid on a like-for-like basis and they haven't. So they should be rejected. The scores for the different sections are combined to arrive at a final score. But you should also note that tenders should never be scored by just one person working alone. It creates the potential or the perception of intentional or unintentional bias in the scoring, or even fraud or collusion. Each standard or criteria should be weighted beforehand according to the importance, and the score should then be multiplied by the weighting to give the total scores. So here's an example of how you would assess the quality submissions from a tender. So the 1 to 5 scoring approach has judgmental statements, and that can be used to aid consistency of judgments between assessors and for different suppliers. So there's no extra marks for exceeding. So for example, I mean, it's really easy to say this meets the standard in most aspects but fails in some, or it meets it well but not exactly, or it meets it exactly as specified. So your judgment could be anything from not worth considering up to excellent. And the reason we don't give extra marks for exceeding standards is because you could end up in a situation with something called specification creep, where the original spec is then improved over time. And that occurs during the tender process where suppliers offer more than what is asked for. And it might seem like a good thing, but accepting spec creep can mean that higher than necessary prices are being paid, potentially for services or functionality that isn't required and won't be used. So evaluators need to check that their scoring submissions are against the specification, not against one another. Evaluators need to be competent to do this. This might mean they need to be trained. It'll also mean that potentially different sections of the tender will be evaluated by different people with the right skills. So procurement might evaluate commercials, while commissioning or operations will consider the technical elements. Now, how do you score price? There's a couple of methods to this using standard differential or relative scoring. A standard differential essentially compares the bids that you're looking at with the lowest bid that's on the table. So in here, what you can see is the lowest price divided by the tender being scored multiplied by the percentage. So in this example, it's 70%. So clearly the lowest one is getting 70 marks. The highest one, which is double the price, is getting half the marks. But then you've got absolute scoring. This works on a sort of price quality ratio. So you're not comparing the supplier from the lowest price by another bidder. You're comparing them against the quality they're offering you. So as you can see on this example, bidder 2 has received the highest quality score. And then we're looking at their price. And if you divide one by the other, you get something called a cost per quality mark. The lowest of that wins. Even though they have a high price, they have a high score, so their cost per quality mark is the lowest of the three on the screen, because the lowest price had a really shocking quality score. which actually means the cost per quality mark is higher. Now, post-tender clarification and post-tender negotiation are not the same. I'm just going to explain the differences between the two. Clarification is simply where the buyer is trying to understand an aspect of the submission that isn't clear. So it's a question that will probably say something like, is this what you mean, or are you sure you meant that? But the supplier gets an opportunity to explain it but not change it. Post-tender negotiation, on the other hand, is where the buyer is seeking to improve the offer that's already been received. And this should only be done with the winning supplier, because that then won't distort competition. And you're just refining the options, but remember, it comes with some risks. So do it with caution. International frameworks are legal frameworks that include a set of rules and regulations. It includes national laws like the Commonwealth Procurement Rules in Australia, and can be derived from membership of international bodies like the World Trade Organization. It's laid down by organisations providing grant aid like the World Bank, and can be specific agreements between individual countries through free trade agreements like NAFTA and the EU. Now, non-discrimination in procurement means not selecting a supplier based on their location or country of origin, which is not permitted. And there are two forms of discrimination. It can either be direct or indirect. Direct discrimination is refusing to allow a supplier from a certain country or a location to bid in your tenders, or penalising them in your scoring mechanism. Indirect would include requiring them to have a licence or a trade association accreditation, which foreign suppliers are unable to achieve because they're only available, let's say, to British retailers. But there are many reasons for and against discrimination. Some believe that it gives them better value for money because smaller suppliers may genuinely be better placed to offer cost, time, or a quality effective solution. Others want to support their local economy. This might be relevant in areas of low employment or social deprivation. It could be for security of supply, like critical supplies for food and defence, which are open to political risk, like war and famine. Or technology, because there might be a need to integrate with existing technology. However, the arguments against it say that it narrows your supply markets, reducing competition. And it could be supporting an inefficient industry, which in the short term has social gains, but in the long term has higher costs. And linking to the technology piece, there's a risk of a monopoly if you're allowing suppliers to control what third-party equipment is being used. This links to the freedoms. Now, certainly for the EU, I know that we have the free movement of goods, services and people. And free movement of goods is one pillar of free trade. So within a free trade area, suppliers can sell their goods without interference from government-imposed restrictions like tariffs, quotas and subsidies. The freedom to provide services is similar to the movement of goods, but there are some barriers due to differences in qualifications and accreditations between the countries. So, for example, a lawyer who is qualified in France can't necessarily practice law in the UK. And then the freedom of establishment. This is the ability to set up an operating base in another country. Transparency and fairness. Equality of treatment means individual bidders are treated in an equitable and fair manner, regardless of where they're from. Transparency is a process that's open to scrutiny, and scrutiny can be in the form of public access to process or rights of review, which is an oversight by a third-party body set up specifically for the purpose of, or the right to challenge by dissatisfied bidders, usually by reference to a professional body or a law court. And mutual recognition is where countries agree to recognise each other's standards, qualification and licences. To enable this, the professional bodies and regulatory authorities issuing licenses and certifications have to work together to harmonise their standards so they're directly comparable. And the final one for this particular learning outcome is to just remind you of the CIPS Code of Ethics and Code of Conduct. This is something as a member you have agreed to adhere to. So the Code of Ethics is about beliefs, and codes of conduct are concerned with behaviour. They set out an expectation of a standard or behaviour, or a moral rather than legal context. Codes of conduct are concerned with behaviour, and we'll just go through the main themes of the CIPS Code of Conduct. What you've agreed to do is to enhance and protect the standing of the profession, maintain the highest standard of integrity in your business relationships, promote the eradication of unethical business practices, enhance the proficiency and stature of the profession, and fully comply with all the laws and regulations of the country which you trade in. I do recommend that you do take some time to look at the CIPS Code of Conduct. It's on the CIPS website. These questions come up quite a lot in the exams, but thank you for watching.